The Hunger Games is really not what people think it's about. And this is going to be perhaps a controversial statement, but I think that most people who hate Gale for his ideology probably in some way or another subscribe to his ideology. I think most people in their beliefs are not a Katniss or a Peeta, they are a Gale. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a bad thing when it gets prim-killed, but you put a pin in that because we'll get there. The thing about the Hunger Games is that it is an allegory. What is an allegory?
Allegory, a story where the characters stand for abstract ideas. For example, good and evil.
I didn't have cable when I was a child. I think the movies, which I'm not here to insult the movies, by the way. I think the movies were fairly well done adaptations, but I think the movies, and also the fact that people read the books when they were maybe a little too young to fully understand them, as well as the way that the franchise as a whole was marketed, gave a lot of people the impression that the Hunger Games is a basic rebellion story, that the moral of the books is just like, you should stand up and rebel. That Katniss is this archetypal chosen one hero, and that Gale and Peeta were low-key just there to be hot guys in a love triangle. Hence the casting of Liam Hemsworth as Gale, which, no offense to Liam Hemsworth. Actually, mild offense, because I'm Team Miley. It was bad casting. It was like tween heartthrob casting over fulfilling Gale's actual character, which, again, is a reason I think people misunderstand Gale. Anyway, what was I saying? Yeah, The Hunger Games is marketed as a young adult tween rebellion story. And that wasn't the case, at all. At all. The Hunger Games knockoffs, like Divergent, those were tween rebellion stories. And I'm not here to shit on those either. Actually, no, I will shit on the end of Divergent because it deserves that. But anyway, I get it. Books and movies have to be marketed. If you try to sell a book and say, hey, this is an allegory for just war theory, and it's also about inequity, politics, division and control, perception and propaganda, it's going to do a lot worse than if you say, hey, Team Peeta or Team Gale?
So is it Team Gale or Team Peeta for the franchise's leading lady, Jennifer Lawrence?
Want to buy this sexy capital makeup?
Easy, breezy, beautiful, cover girl.
Celebrate catching fire with the fiery footlong collection.
Bold can be standing up for what you believe in. Bold can be testing your limits and defying all odds. And now, Bold can be found at Subway. Fiery footlongs, a revolution in bold taste. Sizzling subs like the new Sriracha Chicken Melt. Drizzled in our own signature Sriracha. Made with a select blend of chili peppers for our boldest flavor yet.
Yes, that was a real thing. If you were one of the people who bought the Catching Fire Sriracha Chicken Melt in 2013, let me know how it was. I'm curious. Masquerading a story where the death of children is masked as entertainment and selling a love triangle to try to distract from its true themes, just as the Katniss and Peeta romance is used to divert attention from the death of children and the true rebellion. Art imitates life. Life imitates art. I hate it here. But to be fair, Suzanne Collins said that the marketing was perhaps mimicking the propaganda of the Hunger Games in a self-aware way, but I think she was being diplomatic and perhaps a little generous with that. I truly believe some marketing bro who's never read the books was like, Hunger Games, hunger, Peeta, bread, a Subway collab. So let's break this down. The Hunger Games is an allegory for just war theory. And here's how Suzanne Collins describes that. Just war theory has evolved over thousands of years in an attempt to define what circumstances give you the moral right to wage war and what is acceptable behavior within that war and its aftermath, the why and the how. It helps differentiate between what's considered a necessary and unnecessary war. In the Hunger Games, the districts rebel against their own government because of its corruption. The citizens of the districts have no basic human rights and are treated as slave labor and are subjected to the Hunger Games annually. I believe the majority of today's audience would define that as grounds for a revolution. They have just cause, but the nature of the conflict raises a lot of questions. Do the districts have the authority to wage war? What is their chance of success? Suzanne Collins' father was a veteran who fought in the Vietnam War when she was a kid. She said, even though my mom tried to protect us I'm the youngest of four, sometimes the TV would be on and I would see footage from the war zone. I was little, but I would hear them say Vietnam and I knew my dad was there. And it was very frightening. She said when he got back from Vietnam, she said I was probably about 6. And he, I think, felt it was his responsibility to make sure that all his children had an understanding about war, about its cost, and about its consequences. Which is, her inspiration for writing this book. So just war theory basically deals with the ethical justification for war and what actions are permissible within war. Who has the right to go to war? And what is the right conduct within a war and in the aftermath of the war? How much violence is acceptable to achieve peace? Do the ends justify the means? So Suzanne Collins says most people would probably feel that the districts have the right to wage war. But The Hunger Games as a series goes on to ask the question that she highlights in her quote, do the districts have the authority to wage war? And the even greater question, what actions within a war are justified? So let's break down those two questions, starting with, do the districts have the authority to wage war? Which you might be thinking, what is Suzanne talking about? Of course they do. This question isn't asking, though, do they have the moral grounds to wage a war on the capital? Because she's already said that most people would agree they have the moral justification to wage a war. Whether they have the authority is a different question, as in, if you live under a fully democratic government system, which most of us don't, but theoretically, if you have voted in a fair system for your leaders, theoretically, in a system that doesn't have voter suppression, gerrymandering, super PACs, an electoral college, a lack of poll accessibility, theoretically, just war theory argues that those leaders do possess the authority to wage war on our behalves. But the districts have no legitimate governing body. Do the rebels have the right to declare a war that would bring death and harm to the majority of district members? Do they have the right to decide for others that the ends will justify the means? Do they have the moral right to decide to sacrifice other people's lives for a cause that perhaps not all the district members fully believe in? You might be thinking right now, of course they have the authority. The capital is forcing their children to fight to the death. It's starving them and harming them. Of course they should revolt. The district members that don't want a revolution are either too scared or they're like District 2 and they'd rather kiss up to the capital at the expense of everyone else. So of course the rebels should wage a war on everyone's behalf. Everyone would benefit, and the alternative is continuing to die and suffer anyway. So of course it's justified. And if that's what you're thinking, then you would agree with Gale. Because this was Gale's ideology, right? Gale believes the suffering that is currently happening is so great that it's less than or equal to the suffering that a war would bring, and that a war in the long run has the potential to end the suffering. Katniss, on the other hand, subscribes to the opposite belief. It's funny because in popular culture, Katniss is often seen as, like I said, this archetypal chosen one, heroic leader of the rebellion. Anytime we make a pop culture reference about rebellions, Katniss is always brought up. But in the books, Katniss is very, very reluctant to rebel, and her role in the rebellion was, for the most part, symbolic. There's a reason Katniss doesn't actually take down Snow in the end, in the way that Harry takes down Voldemort. She's not the chosen one. She's on a propaganda mission that goes wrong while the rest of the rebel soldiers are out there actually seizing power, actually seizing the capital and arresting Snow. Remember, Katniss was the Mockingjay. She was a symbol. She was largely a propaganda puppet for the rebels to unite the districts. And it's funny that most people remember her, how she was portrayed in the rebels' propaganda, than for who she actually was. And you may have a negative connotation when I say the word propaganda, but Katniss being a propaganda piece isn't, it's not necessarily a criticism of the rebellion. Propaganda is a tool of war. Suzanne Collins herself says, propaganda decides the outcome of war. This is why Plutarch implements the airtime assault. He understands that whoever controls the airwaves controls the power. So they filmed propaganda videos of her fighting in order to try to unite the districts. Because remember, going back to our earlier conversation, not everyone in the districts wanted to fight, including Katniss. Katniss was one of those district members who, for the most part, did not want the rebellion. She, unlike Gale, did not believe the ends would justify the means, did not think they had a remote chance of winning. Because this is another question Suzanne Collins asks. She says, what is the chance of success? Because if the rebels fail, then people will have suffered and died needlessly in the war, and the end result will be that the capital brings upon even greater suffering than before. Do the rebels have the authority to gamble everyone's lives like that for the chance of winning? Gale's answer to this is yes. Rebellion at any cost. Katniss's answer is no. We cannot play with our family's lives like that. Here's a conversation between the two of them where she talks about how her act of holding out those berries to Peeta was a spark in the rebellion. Katniss says, "It's my fault, Gale, because of what I did in the arena. If I had just killed myself with those berries, none of this would have happened. Peeta could have come home and lived, and everyone else would have been safe too. Safe to do what? He says in a gentler tone. Starve? Work like slaves? Send their kids to the reaping? You haven't hurt people. You've given them an opportunity. Don't you see? It's happening. It's finally happening. If there's been an uprising in District 8, why not here? Why not everywhere? This could be it. The thing we've... Stop it. You don't know what you're saying. The peacekeepers outside of 12, they're not like Darius or even Cray. The lives of district people, they mean less than nothing to them, I say. That's why we have to join the fight, he answers harshly. No, we have to leave before they kill us and a lot of other people too. I'm yelling again, but I can't understand why he's doing this. Why doesn't he see what's so undeniable? What about the other families, Katniss? The ones who can't run away? Don't you see? It can't be about just saving us anymore. Not if the rebellion's begun. Gale shakes his head, not hiding his disgust with me. You could do so much. So you have two different perspectives on the just war theory question here. Gale says, yes, we have the authority to wage war and we can win. And Katniss says, no, we do not have the authority and we cannot win. So here's another example of that perspective. You don't know how those District 2 people ended up in the nut, I say. They may have been coerced. They may have been held against their will. Some are our own spies. Will you kill them too? Gale says, I would sacrifice a few, yes, to take out the rest of them. And if I were a spy in there, I'd say, bring on the avalanches. I know he's telling the truth, that Gale would sacrifice his life in this way for the cause. No one doubts it. Perhaps we'd all do the same if we were spies and given the choice. I guess I would. But it's a cold-hearted decision to make for other people and those who love them. Which side of the debate would you have been on? Would you agree with Katniss, who just wants to stay alive and keep her family safe, who believes the chance of success is so small it's not worth the high risk of great suffering, death, and punishment the war and losing the war would bring, that it's not a decision they have the right to make for others? Or would you be on Gale's side, that you know your family already isn't safe, they're already having their names drawn to fight to the death, they're already being starved and tortured, they have nothing to lose? And I want you to think about it both philosophically and practically, because philosophically, it might be easier to see it when you're reading it in a story and see it one way. But practically, if it was happening to you, if it was you and your family at risk here, what would you choose? Now let's get back to the second question, which I think is really the most important question, and in some ways the thesis of this story, which is what acts within a war are justified? And what on earth does it have to do with the Katniss, Peeta, Gale love triangle? The Hunger Games is a what? An allegory. Holy shit, I sound like an English teacher. I need to say something. I hated English in school. I hated it. I
despised, I loathed, disparaged, abhorred. I hated English class so much. Because I was like, why do we devote an hour of our time every single day to analyzing made-up stories? Like, whatever.
I realize the hypocrisy of everything I'm saying right now. I do. I truly do. But anyway, where the was I? The love triangle is not a love triangle. It's an allegory. Peeta and Gale appeared quickly, less as 2 points on a love triangle and more as two perspectives in the just war debate. Gale, because of his experiences and temperament, tends towards violent remedies. Peeta's natural inclination is towards diplomacy. Katniss isn't just deciding on a partner. She's figuring out her worldview. Gale and Peeta represent two perspectives in the just war debate. As we see in Katniss's thoughts at the end of the book, Gale is symbolized by fire and Peeta is symbolized by the dandelion in the spring. Gale represents violent remedies and Peeta represents compassion and diplomacy. So what does this mean? To understand why Gale represents what he does and the choices he makes, we have to understand where he's coming from and how his life experiences have shaped this worldview. Gale grew up in the poorest area of the poorest district. In the book, this seam is inhabited by people with olive skin and dark hair compared to the richer merchant, blonde-haired, blue-eyed class where Peeta is from. And though their races aren't specified, Suzanne Collins is definitely saying something here by making this physical distinction about how race, class, and oppression are all inextricably linked. People in the seam are forced to take the most strenuous, dangerous jobs, which of course is coal mining, which is how Katniss and Gale's fathers both died, which of course sent Gale and Katniss's families into a further spiral of poverty, which shows how people in the seam are forced into this vicious feedback loop of poverty that they're unable to escape from. Of course, they're also forced to enter their names into the games more often in order to ensure their survival and the survival of their families. Won't be going to the capital, Gale says coolly. His eyes land on a small, circular pin that adorns her dress. Real gold, beautifully crafted. It could keep a family in bread for months. What can you have? 5 entries? I had 6 when I was just 12 years old. We walked toward the seam in silence. I don't like that Gale took a dig at Madge, but he's right, of course. The reaping system is unfair, with the poor getting the worst of it. It's this idea that the odds are never in their favor, right? And Gale understands this system better than Katniss does. He knows that the reason the Capitol does this is to foster division and resentment among the citizens of individual districts, the same way they sow divisions among all the districts by making them fight one another in the games. Gale understands the people in power have a vested interest in ensuring the districts do not band together, so they do whatever they can to divide them, to keep them in survival mode, so they are forced to compete against one another for resources. Gale, who was born into the bottom of this system, who has experienced the brunt of the violence and oppression of the system, has nothing to lose. And he's rightfully angry. And you can understand why he sees the world in black and white. Either the Capitol falls or the districts continue to suffer. Violent remedies are necessary to destroy a violent system. And any cost, including human lives, is acceptable if it means freedom from the system that places no value on their lives. Everyone who is complicit in the games, whether that is the game makers themselves or the Capitol citizens who only watch the games or District 2 who chooses not to fight with the rebellion, is a fair target. If they are not with Gale, they are his enemy. In his worldview, there are no innocents on the other side. While Katniss shows compassion for her prep team, Gale is disgusted by the fact that they could be complicit in creating a spectacle of forcing children to fight to the death. And wouldn't you? Wouldn't you feel the exact same as Gale in this scenario? Gale says, "Katniss, why do you care so much about your prep team?" I open my eyes to see if he's joking, but he's frowning down at the rabbit he's skinning. Why shouldn't I? Let's see. Because they've spent the last year prepping you up for slaughter, he suggests. It's more complicated than that. I know them. They're not evil or cruel. They're not even smart. Hurting them is like hurting children. They don't see, they don't know. I get knotted up in my words. They don't know what, Katniss, he says. That the tributes who are actual children involved here, not your trio of freaks, are forced to fight to the death? That you were going into that arena for people's amusement? Was that a big secret in the Capitol? No, but they don't view it the way we do, I say. They're raised on it. Are you actually defending them? Katniss, who has been to the Capitol, who has had a chance to talk and interact with Capitol citizens, humanizes them. She sees them as people. She has felt their compassion even as they were dressing her up to go to the games, and knows them as individuals. And as a result, she looks at the situation with more nuance. She doesn't believe that District 13 has the right to torture and hurt them just because they're Capitol citizens, just because they participated in the games. She sees a difference between the prep team, who are just participating in a system they were raised in, and say Snow, who actually created and is enforcing that system. And Suzanne Collins doesn't directly answer the question of whose worldview is correct here. All she is doing is demonstrating how different worldviews contribute to what tactics you then believe are just in war. So let's take a look at how those worldviews contribute to what each of them considers to be a just action in war. Here's the conversation Katniss and Gale have when it comes to the weapons Gale has designed for the rebellion. At some point, Gale and Beetee left the wilderness behind and focused more on human impulses, like compassion. A bomb explodes. Time is allowed for people to rush in and aid the wounded. Then a second, more powerful bomb kills them as well. That seems to be crossing some kind of line, I say. So anything goes? They both stare at me, Beetee with doubt, Gale with hostility. I guess there isn't a rule book for what might be unacceptable to do to another human being. Sure there is. Beetee and I have been following the same rule book President Snow used when he hijacked Peeta, Gale says. Now he draws back, almost impatiently. Katniss, what difference is there really between crushing our enemies in a mine or blowing them out of the sky with one of Beetee's arrows? The result is the same. I don't know. We were under attack in 8 for one thing. The hospital was under attack, I say. Yes, and those hover planes came from District 2. So by taking them out, we prevented further attacks. With that kind of thinking, you could turn it into an argument for killing anyone at any time. You could justify sending kids into the Hunger Games to prevent the districts from getting out of line, I say. I don't buy that, he tells me. So it'd be easy for you? Using that on people? I ask. I didn't say that. Gale drops the bow to his side. But if I'd had a weapon that could have stopped what I saw happen in 12, if I'd had a weapon that could have kept you out of the arena, I'd have used it. What actions are just in a war? Katniss believes that disguising weapons in aid, that using compassion as a means to kill more people, that killing innocent civilians crosses some sort of line. Katniss believes that they must have some moral guidelines for the actions they take. Gale believes that they are justified in employing as cruel tactics on the Capitol as the Capitol has employed on them, that some collateral damage is necessary if it prevents future violence. Violence as a means of liberation from a violent system. Fight fire with fire. If we burn, you burn with us. Which you'll know was Katniss's line. Remember, this isn't Katniss versus Gale. This is Peeta versus Gale, and we'll get to Peeta in a second. But Katniss also has much of Gale's fire. She grew up under the same oppressive conditions he did. Her father died just as his did. And she, unlike Gale, was actually forced into the games. And while we see her many times in the book fueled by that same fire and rage, we also see her leaning towards Peeta's worldview much of the time as well. Like right here, Katniss is arguing that the dehumanization that Gale treats the other side with is the same dehumanization that led the Capitol to send children to the games, whether it's a natural inclination for compassion, whether it's her own survival instinct, or whether it's the fact that the games showed her firsthand what happens when you dehumanize people to the point where you're okay with killing children. Katniss is caught between the struggle of these two worldviews. This is why when it comes to how to deal with District 2, Katniss and Gale are at odds once again. The majority of workers are citizens from 2, says Beetee neutrally. So what, says Gale. We'll never be able to trust them again. They should at least have a chance to surrender, says Lime. Well, that's a luxury we weren't given when they firebombed 12. But you're all so much cozier with the Capitol here, says Gale. By the look on Lime's face, I think she might shoot him, or at least take a swing. She'd probably have the upper hand too, with all her training. But her anger only seems to infuriate him, and he yells, "We watched children burn to death, and there was nothing we could do." I have to close my eyes a minute, as the image rips through me. It has the desired effect. I want everyone in that mountain dead. I'm about to say so. But then, I'm also a girl from District 12, not President Snow. I can't help it. I can't condemn someone to the death he's suggesting. Gale, I say, taking his arm and trying to speak in a reasonable tone. The nut's an old mine. It'd be like causing a massive coal mining accident.
Even if those civilians are just mopping floors, they're helping the enemy. And if they have to die, I can live with that. No one who supports the Capitol is innocent.
With that kind of thinking, you can kill whoever you want.
But not so quick as the one that killed our fathers, he retorts. Is that everyone's problem? That our enemies might have a few hours to reflect on the fact that they're dying instead of just being blown to bits? Gale believes that sacrifices are necessary for the greater good. He, again, understandably, is ready to be as violent as necessary to stop atrocities from happening again, after having seen his district burn. Suzanne Collins says in an interview, I think many conflicts grow out of fear, and in an attempt to counter that fear, people reach for solutions that may be comforting in the short term, but only increase their vulnerability in the long run and cause a lot of destruction along the way. So Katniss is struggling between these two worldviews. She remembers how the people of 12 burned to death and is ready to kill everyone in that mountain. But then, unlike Gale, whose fire is kindled with the need for vengeance, who sees vengeance as justice, who sees this as a necessity to stop the atrocity from happening to his people again, Katniss just sees people. And she sees condemning everyone in the mountain to death not as preventing a future atrocity, but as an atrocity itself. This is the worldview that Peeta represents: love, compassion, hope, diplomacy, and minimizing harm. Throughout the games, Peeta's actions are led by love. He doesn't want to fight, though he will if he must. He understands that by fighting, by committing acts of violence, he is doing what the Capitol wants. He becomes a piece in their games. In this world where the Capitol has a vested interest in making sure none of the people they are oppressing have compassion for one another, because unity of the masses is a threat to their power, Peeta knows that compassion and refusing to cause harm, that retaining his humanity, is an act of rebellion itself. Now, of course, the moral of the story isn't as simple as be nice.
Nice is different than good.
Let's be clear, this is not Suzanne Collins simply saying violence is bad, even when it's against an oppressive regime that's making kids fight to the death. Choose love, not war, kids. That's not at all what she's saying here. I'm going to get to what I think she's saying at the end of the video. But for now, let me just say that Suzanne Collins never directly answers this question for you. of what acts of violence are just in war, of what kind of wars are just, any of these questions she's asking. The Hunger Games is a book that, like all great stories, asks you a lot of questions. This isn't a fable where you learn a specific lesson at the end. It's a conversation that she's having with you. It's a conversation about war, about just war theory that is meant to have you think about your worldview. So let's think about it. Going back to Peeta, just as we see what happens when Gale's worldview goes too far, which we'll talk about in a second, we see also what happens when Peeta's worldview goes too far. Because, of course, the hijacked version of Peeta demonstrates this. When the Capitol is using him as a propaganda pawn, similar to how Katniss is being used in the rebellion, Peeta argues that there must be a ceasefire, that the rebels must lay down their weapons to save themselves and stop the violence.
Stop the violence.
That this war is only causing suffering and will lead to more suffering, so it must end. Which, as Katniss points out, will only return the districts to their previous status or worse, and a ceasefire would just be a win for the Capitol. Because that's the thing, isn't it? Can you win a war without violence? How much violence is justified? What acts of violence are justified? Because we see that though Katniss does not want to commit acts of violence, as the war goes on, she must do so to both survive and keep those she loves alive, as well as to win the war. She wears a bright turquoise silk robe embroidered with exotic birds. Her magenta hair is fluffed up like a cloud and decorated with gilded butterflies. Grease from half-eaten sausage she's holding smears her lipstick. The expression on her face says she recognizes me. She opens her mouth to call for help. Without hesitation, I shoot her through the heart. She kills a citizen without hesitation because the alternative is they get caught and tortured to death. And of course, in order to end the cycle of violence, Katniss has to commit an act of violence, killing Coin. I think most people would feel that these acts of violence are justified, and that hijacked Peeta's argument that they should not fight at all will only lead to their continued suffering, and will, like I said, be a win for the Capitol. But we also see what happens when Gale's worldview goes too far. Because when you unleash that fire, you don't know who's going to get burned.
When you fire that first shot, no matter how right you feel, you have no idea who's going to die. How much blood will spill until everybody does what they were always going to have to do from the very beginning. Sit down and talk!
Especially when the fire is kindled by a rage that leads to dehumanization. We see what happens when Gale believes that violence at any cost is necessary to win. We see what happens when he becomes okay with collateral damage and employing as cruel tactics on the Capitol as the Capitol employed on the districts. What happens is the death of Prim, who, as you remember, was killed by a weapon designed by Gale, a weapon that was dropped on innocent Capitol children who thought they were receiving aid only for it to be bombs. When the medics, including Prim, rushed in to help, the second bomb went off, killing everyone. And this is the culmination of those competing worldviews. This is where Gale is no longer a viable option in the love triangle. I see a lot of people asking why Prim had to die when Katniss's whole journey was to save her. The answer is because that is the cost of war. Suzanne Collins says, the dramatic question, can Katniss save Prim, is introduced in the first chapter of the first book and not answered until almost the end of the trilogy. At first, there's the relief that yes, she can volunteer for Prim. Then Rue, who reminds her of Prim, joins the arena and she can't save her. That tragedy refreshes the question. For most of the second book, Prim's largely out of harm's way, although there's always the threat that the Capitol might hurt her to hurt Katniss. The Jabberjays are a reminder of that. Once she's in District 13 and the war has shifted to the Capitol, Katniss begins to hope that Prim's not only safe, but has a bright future as a doctor. But it's an illusion. The danger that made Prim vulnerable in the beginning, the threat of the arena, still exists. In the first book, it's a venue for the games. In the second, the platform for the revolution. In the third, it's the battleground of Panem, coming to a head in the Capitol. The arena transforms, but it's never eradicated. In fact, it's expanded to include everyone in the country. Can Katniss save Prim? No, because no one is safe while the arena exists.
It's war, Katniss. Sometimes killing isn't personal.
That is also the cost of Gale's lack of restraint when it comes to violence. Innocent children die. And it had to be Prim. It couldn't be unnamed capital children that die in the story to teach us this. It had to be someone we knew and loved. Because the innocent capital children, like the little girl in the lemon dress that Katniss sees shot to death, that certainly makes people question. But once it becomes Prim that dies, it becomes intolerable. And once we see how intolerable it is to kill Prim, we understand how intolerable it is to kill any child, whether they were born in the capital or the districts. We see the true and devastating impacts of what happens when you wage a war without restraint to the acts of violence you're willing to commit. And this, again, is not as simple as Suzanne Collins telling us violence is not the answer. It's her showing us the consequences of a worldview that puts very little value on human life. As Katniss says, something is significantly wrong with a creature that sacrifices its children's lives to settle its differences. You can spin it any way you'd like. Snow thought the Hunger Games were an efficient means of control. Coin thought the parachutes would expedite the war. But in the end, who does it benefit? No one. The truth is, it benefits no one to live in a world where these things happen. This is why up until this point, Gale remains an option in the love triangle. This is why the love triangle exists, to show Katniss coming to an understanding of what her worldview is throughout the story. This is what's important to remember about Katniss. In a world where those at the top oppressing her wanted her to think everyone else was her enemy, Katniss chose Rue as an ally. She gambled her own safety to try to help District 8. She publicly held hands with the other tributes before the Quarter Quell. She extended a hand to the citizens in District 2 who were not on her side. She refused to harm the capital children in the way she was harmed. These were all acts of rebellion, and I think that is what people forget. Katniss's rebellion was largely not in fighting. It was in having compassion for others in a world where those in power had a vested interest in making sure people did not have compassion for one another. When I saw the mountain fall tonight, I thought, they've done it again. Got me to kill you. The people in the districts. But why did I do it? District 12 and District 2 have no fight except the one the capital gave us. The young man blinks at me uncomprehendingly. I sit on my knees before him, my voice low and urgent. And why are you fighting with the rebels on the rooftops? With Lime, who was your victor? With the people who were your neighbors, maybe even your family? I don't know, says the man, but he doesn't take his gun off me. I rise and turn slowly in a circle, addressing the machine guns. And you up there? I come from a mining town. Since when do miners condemn other miners to that kind of death and then stand by to kill whoever manages to crawl from the rebel? Who is the enemy? Whispers Haymitch. These people, I indicate the wounded bodies in the square, are not your enemy. I whip back around to the train station. The rebels are not your enemy. We all have one enemy, and it's the capital. There's an interesting quote that Suzanne Collins cites when talking about her work by Edward Abbey, who said, "The tragedy of modern war is that the young men die fighting each other instead of their real enemies back home in the capitals." And remember, Katniss's first act of rebellion started with a refusal to commit violence when she held those berries out. The moments began to come, thick and fast, and in no particular order. When I took Rue on as an ally, extended my hand to Chafe on interview night, tried to... Is it Chafe or Chaff? Oh my god. Tried to carry Mags, and again, when I held out those berries that meant different things to different people. Love for Peeta, refusal to give in under impossible odds, defiance of the capital's inhumanity. And in the end, Katniss chooses Peeta, and the worldview Peeta represents, when she chooses to end the cycle of violence. When Coin proposes another Hunger Games with the capital children, with the justification for it being that it would prevent future violence. Was it like this then, 75 years or so ago? Did a group of people sit around and cast their votes on initiating the Hunger Games? Was there dissent? Did someone make a case for mercy that was beaten down by the calls for the deaths of the district's children? The scent of Snow's rose curls up in my nose, down my throat, squeezing it tight with despair. All those people I loved, dead, and we're discussing the next Hunger Games in an attempt to avoid wasting life. Nothing has changed. Nothing will ever change now. I weigh my options carefully, think everything through. Keeping my eyes on the rose, I say, I vote yes.
For Prim.
Which of course we know that yes was to gain Coin's trust so Katniss could kill her. In that moment, Katniss has decided to end the cycle of violence for Prim. But remember, like I said, to end the violence, she must commit an act of violence by killing Coin. And Suzanne talks about how the Hunger Games deals with that cycle of violence that seems impossible to break out of. And though Katniss chooses Peeta in the end, represented as the dandelion in the spring versus Gale's fire, she says, "What I need to survive is not Gale's fire, kindled with rage and hatred. I have plenty of fire myself. What I need is the dandelion in the spring, the bright yellow that means rebirth instead of destruction. The promise that life can go on no matter how bad our losses, that it can be good again. And only Peeta can give me that." And though she chooses this worldview of ending the cycle of violence, it's an interesting question of, can you win the war without Gale's fire? Which brings us back to the original question: what acts of violence in a war are justified, and what do you lose in the process of committing these acts? Suzanne Collins wrote this book to ask questions. She does not necessarily give an answer at the end of the book because there really is no straightforward answer to this question. And though Suzanne Collins has Katniss choose a worldview at the end of the book, like I said, the book really exists to ask us this question. It doesn't necessarily directly answer this question. But Suzanne Collins says, "Yes, I knew which worldview would win, but in the interest of examining just war theory, you need to make the arguments as strongly as possible on both sides. While Katniss ultimately chooses Peeta, remember that in order to end the Hunger Games, her last act is to assassinate an unarmed woman. The point is to take the reader through the journey, have them confront the issues with the protagonist, and then hopefully inspire them to think about it and discuss it. What would they do in Katniss's situation? How would they define a just or unjust war? And what behavior is acceptable within warfare? The hope is that better discussions might lead to more nonviolent forms of conflict resolution, so we evolve out of choosing war as an option." I'll go ahead and give you my interpretation of the ending, which is just my interpretation, okay? I'm not an English teacher pretending I know exactly what Suzanne Collins was thinking here, okay? But I think this is saying we need fire to win rebellions. And Suzanne Collins doesn't just equate fire with violence. In an interview, she says fire is a symbol for change, as well as renewal, passion, anger, destruction, and sacredness. But though fire is sometimes necessary, fire like Gale's, kindled with rage and hatred, as Katniss describes it toward the end of the book, only contributes to the cycle of violence in the end. In order to survive and end that cycle of violence, we need Peeta, the dandelion in the spring, compassion, diplomacy, hope, the belief that people are good, the belief that life can be good. It reminds me of the movie The Wild Robot, which I watched recently, which you should all watch if you haven't, because it's great, where they say, kindness is a survival skill. Suzanne Collins says, if you look carefully at what happens in the arena, it's Katniss's compassionate choices that determine her survival. Taking on Rue as an ally results in Thresh sparing her life. Seeking out Peeta and caring for him when she discovers how badly wounded he is ultimately leads her to winning the games. She only uses force in self-defense or defense of a third party, and I'm including Cato's mercy killing in that. As the trilogy progresses, it becomes increasingly difficult to avoid the use of force because the overall violence is escalating in the war. The how and the why becomes harder to answer. Because again, though we of course want to get to a place where we can solve all our problems with kindness, compassion, and diplomacy, that's not the current world we live in. As Plutarch puts it, now we're in that sweet period where everyone agrees that our recent horrors should never be repeated, he says, but collective thinking is usually short-lived. We're fickle, stupid beings with poor memories and a great gift for self-destruction. Although who knows, maybe this will be at Katniss. What, I ask, the time it sticks. Maybe we're witnessing the evolution of the human race. Think about that. And this sentiment was also echoed by Suzanne Collins in an interview. She said, we can change. We can evolve as a species. It's not simple. It's a very long and drawn-out process, but you can hope. In the end, there's certainly a little bit of Gale's worldview in all of us. How can there not be? With the world we're living in. That anger and hate, that burning need for justice that can so easily slip into a need for vengeance. We can't hate him because we are him. But we also need to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to create? Who do we want to be? And how do we get there?